My name is Bahia Yasmin Robinson, and I'm a proud member of the Ceres President's Council. I'm also the CEO and founder of VC Include, a platform of diverse fund managers and LPs wanting to invest in diverse and women-led impact private equity and VC funds. It's my pleasure to introduce the next plenary, Building a Just and Inclusive Economy. Over the last year, the global pandemic has highlighted the racial and economic divisions within our country. As we attempt to build it back better, it's essential that we create an economy that is more resilient, inclusive, and equitable so that everyone can benefit, not just a privileged few. This plenary also kicks off an important track of sessions at the Ceres Conference 2021, the Just and Inclusive Economy track, so make sure you stay tuned for more engaging and informative sessions on these topics and more tomorrow and Thursday. You will now hear from two experts, Rachel Robichodi, founder and CEO of Addisina Capital, and Alicia Johnson, Strategic Communications, Environment, Policy, and Social Initiatives at Apple, about how companies and investors can change their practices to prioritize the voices of those disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. These two women will also discuss how the private sector can and must create new pathways for a more inclusive economy and economic prosperity for all. I'm thrilled to pass it over to our brilliant speakers, Rachel and Alicia. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Hello, Alicia and everyone in the audience. It's always important to me to be very present with what's happening in the moment. And I just want to say that at Addisina Social Capital, we have team members in Boulder who shop at the very grocery store that was impacted yesterday by the mass shooting. And so our thoughts and prayers and hearts go out to them. They are thankfully in safe and in good health, but I do just want to take a moment of silence in respect for the victims of that shooting. Thank you for that, everyone. Very pleased to be in this conversation. The work that we do at Addisina Social Capital is about making a just and inclusive, regenerative economy that we all deserve moving forward. We're an investment and financial activism firm, and we serve as a bridge between financial markets and social justice movements. So we're a team of diverse people from non-traditional backgrounds, and we're committed to making that kind of large-scale systemic change through investment in public markets. And what's particular about our approach is that we work closely with the communities that we intend to impact, both to build our investment criteria and also expand our impact beyond our own portfolios with industry campaigns and education. And then by doing that, we align investors and movements, which allows them to become these powerful agents of meaningful change for people and our planet. Alicia, I'd like to give you an opportunity to share a bit about the tremendous work that you're doing at Apple and just set the context for what we'll be talking more about today on your end.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Sending love to your colleagues in Boulder, and just glad to hear that everyone is safe. And thanks so much, Bahia, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited for this conversation. Both of you, amazing women who are doing such critical work in this space. As you mentioned, I lead external engagement for Apple's social impacts, and that work is really centered, for a long time has been centered on our environmental initiatives. You heard Lisa Jackson, my boss, speak with Melody Hobson today about sustainable leadership for businesses. But as we branch into the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative, which I also have the pleasure of leading, we are increasingly recognizing that the lens of racial equity and justice really needs to be the focus for all of our impacts. When you look at our environmental initiatives, when you look at our education partnerships, when you look at our community investment and our philanthropic giving, it all really centers on the lens of the communities that are most impacted. And so we're really excited to talk more about the work that you're doing with Addisina and how we can really bridge that with the work that Apple is doing. So I'll start with you. If you search Apple News right now for the rise of sustainable investing, you get thousands of articles that are dissecting the trends and what they mean for the larger economy. But Adesina seems to think a little bit differently about what sustainable investing should look like, and actively includes the voices of the social justice movement leaders in your assessment of companies. So how did you land on that process? And for investors who are looking for suggestions on how to incorporate that key dimension into their sustainable investing and decision-making process, what would you tell them?
So at Adesina, we believe that while ESG and sustainable investing have all of the right intentions, they're not necessarily engaging the most impacted communities. And in doing that, they end up missing the most impactful metrics for change, because we have this core belief that those who are closest to the problem but farthest from the power have a unique perspective. And by listening to those communities and really letting them lead, we end up getting metrics that are naturally intersectional, because what impacts the environment has a disproportionate impact on communities of color, on women, and on other groups in society that may not traditionally have held the power. And so that's what our exchange traded fund, the Adesina Social Justice All Cap Global ETF is really designed to reflect, is a fund with a set of metrics for public companies that really has a significant impact for those communities that we intend to center as we're making change. So it's beyond what looks good to, we often say, what actually is good for those who are most impacted. And we know that that it's not just investors, but also companies have to center the voices of those most affected by social issues if we're going to have any meaningful impact. And I know that that's something, Alicia, that you care about and Apple cares about significantly. So how is the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative centering and uplifting the voices of people who have historically been marginalized by the impacts of racism and climate change? And I'm wondering how you're ensuring that impact after the first check is cut, particularly how those lessons are kind of trickling into other parts of your business and sustainability would be great to hear about.
Absolutely. And you said it so well, that the communities that are most impacted have to be centered in the solutions. And that's been something that we've really focused on in our environmental work for so long. And it's created a great model for the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative. The great benefit to starting off on this very challenging work, which we kicked off in June of 2020, is that we already had a really good foundation at Apple of work that was really focused on increasing access to opportunity and technology for underserved communities, and helping to create opportunities to capital for communities of color and entrepreneurs of color. And so we were able to build on a lot of those efforts, and we focused our work in a couple of areas where we knew that we could have a tremendous impact. And yes, we put a $100 million commitment behind it. That was incredibly important to us because Apple is a company of significant resources, and it was really key that we demonstrate that we're willing to deploy those resources toward an issue that we view as an ultimate priority. So education is the first focus area that we put a lot of interest into. We have a strong foundation of that at Apple. It's been a key part of our mission since we started as a company. And so that work is now manifesting is really building on our partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities, with Hispanic serving institutions, community colleges, and minority serving institutions. We launched the Propel Center in January, and that is really Apple serving as the key technology partner for a center based physically in Atlanta with a virtual hub that is going to serve as an empowerment space for all historically Black colleges and universities. And we're opening up not just Apple's technology expertise, but the full suite of Apple's business expertise so that we can really help to scale up HBCUs and create the next inclusive workforce. So that's been a really exciting partnership. Another space for us and a key priority is economic empowerment. We as a company spend a lot of money in our supply chain across professional services, and we have an immediate opportunity to scale up our spend with Black and Brown owned businesses, and we have some pretty robust internal goals for doing that. But we also know that we can help to really scale and resource entrepreneurs of color, and we're doing that through our Entrepreneur Camp for Black developers. We just completed the first cohort in February and had some incredible leaders come through that program, and we're really excited to connect them with all of the expertise within Apple to really help to next level their businesses. We also launched, we talk about that intersection between some of our key values. We launched what we call the Impact Accelerator. as we are on our journey to carbon neutrality by the year 2030 for our carbon footprint, we know that there are businesses led by people of color that are doing really critical work in the environmental space. And so we want to really put a focus on those businesses, help to scale them up so that they can work within Apple's supply chain to help us to meet our goal, but also for others in our industry who also have a lot of similar ambition in the environmental space. So it's been exciting to really make those connections across Apple, looking at all of the ways that we can really connect this work to the work that we're doing. So back to you. We know that a lot of investors have made commitments to address racial justice, and some are doing more than others. So for those who are still trying to understand what they can do, why is it so important for them to understand the mass incarceration system and criminal justice reform in their role as investors?
So I often remind folks that when we invest, what we're doing is sending a message about what we want more of. This is a good idea, make more of this in the world. And when we look at the state of mass incarceration of Black and Brown people in the United States, and also the investment industries profiting from that, it really is a different focus from simply looking at equity, diversity, inclusion, which are all extremely important. But we really have to focus on stopping the harm as well as building up kind of the pipelines in those ways. And so it's been really reassuring to see more investors lean into conversations on racial justice. And as much as possible, we're really wanting investors and are seeing investors start to focus on mass incarceration. We saw a lot of Ceres, Ceres itself and the mini-series investors sign on to the racial justice investing statement and use our racial justice exclusion list that highlighted not only private prisons, but also different parts in that process, including the money bail system and other major suppliers to the system of mass incarceration. But it's important, I believe, that investors understand that we have a deep commitment to intersectionality. Like, how does racial justice and climate justice, how do those come together? And when we asked the communities that were most impacted by the issues that intersect where racial and climate justice are considered, they told us that extractive agriculture, in particular, is something that impacts communities at a global and a very local scale. And so that's something that we're going to be bringing not only into our portfolio, but into the wider investment space and sharing that data and knowledge with the investors that we work with to build solidarity around that particular issue later this year. So in the long run, we know that these types of inequities reverberate throughout the broader financial system, and they aren't limited, right, to the specific issue that we may be addressing. But I am curious about how a tech giant like Apple came to focus on criminal justice reform. I know how we arrived there, but I'm really curious, Alicia, about how Apple arrived there and what that story is.
Absolutely, you're right. We do have a third pillar, and that is criminal justice reform. Unlike education and economic empowerment, where we have really specific, what we think is subject matter expertise, criminal justice reform is an area that we as a company have not worked in. But you're absolutely right. When you look at systemic racism, when you look at barriers to access for opportunity for people of color, the criminal justice system is so central to that. And it's impossible, I think, for us to look at systemic racism broadly if we don't focus on that space and look at the opportunities for Apple to have an impact across the full spectrum of the system. And so in the near term, what we really wanted to focus on is resourcing the groups that have been on the front lines of this work. Groups like the Equal Justice Initiative led by Brian Stevenson, increasingly our work with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Black Lives Matter Foundation, so many organizations that have been really, really critical in this work. And we also can't ignore the fact that iPhone and smartphones in general have played a central role in shedding light on a lot of the injustices in our criminal justice system. I can remember back in 2016 watching on my phone the murder of Philando Castile. More recently, so many of us watched George Floyd murdered on camera, and that is something that drove awareness as difficult it has been, and I think has engaged a lot of people in these conversations who may not have otherwise wanted to take action. And so down the line, maybe there are opportunities for a company like Apple to do work intentionally to drive transparency in the criminal justice system through the power of technology. We also look at workforce development for those coming out of the criminal justice system. So we see a lot of opportunity for impact there. And again, we're so focused on partnership right now and really centering the voices that have been such strong advocates for this work for such a long time. I want to pivot a little bit because I know that there are so many people who are starting out in this work that are wanting to ensure that not only they're doing the work, but that they're incredibly transparent about their progress. And I think you're absolutely an expert in this space. So for those who are beginning their journey here, what does good disclosure look like?
I believe that good disclosure ultimately comes down to what those that each of our companies and each of our whether we're in the investment world or we're actually a publicly traded company, I think it really comes down to ultimately what are they saying the deep impact is of these very large companies, right, that are in the public markets. And ultimately, it's before disclosure comes the relationship. And it's ultimately about building relationships with those communities, understanding what their needs are, and ultimately being willing to come to the table in a very open-handed way and say, what is it that you need to know about our practices? That has come in a number of ways for us around racial, gender, economic, and climate justice. On gender justice, we've been asking companies a number of issues, one of which is focusing on forced arbitration for sexual harassment. We've been asking companies about what wages they're paying and taking a look at sub-minimum wages. And around racial justice, it's centrally definitely been around mass incarceration, but we are also asking those justice, equity, diversity, inclusion questions as well. And it's interesting. Our large companies came to be the sizes that they are because they were allowed to offer shares to the public ultimately. And so it's coming to remember that like their size and their ability to impact the world kind of came from the public. And so there's a very real need for disclosure back to that public that is so impacted by corporate behavior. And so a big question for me that I'd love to hear from you about is who really should own this work inside of companies? Because it's one thing for me to talk very broadly about companies and disclosure that's useful, but you're really kind of on the ground in the company. Does every company need an Office of Racial Justice, or could this somehow be more integrated throughout? I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one where I'm so grateful to have had a model to follow, and it's what we did with our environmental work. Even today, even as the team has grown, Apple's core environment team is actually fairly small, and it's because this team sets the strategy for the work, but for the work to really reverberate across the company, it has to be the role of every single employee. And so some of our greatest environmental innovation has been through the work of our engineers, our designers, our procurement experts, really with that strategy being set by a small team and then carrying out throughout the company. Our work for racial justice is no different. So to answer your question, I absolutely believe every company should have a racial justice initiative. But I think for the work to really be impactful, it has to feel like the role of every single employee. And I think when you look at some of the announcements that we've made recently, you look at our Detroit Developer Academy, those are teams within Apple that have already established developer academies in communities of need where there is a free curriculum for those who are accepted into the academy to learn coding, entrepreneurship, marketing. That's tapping into another space at Apple. Those who are experts in this, who are looking at ways that they can channel that expertise to the communities where they're needed. We do that across so many spaces. The Propel Center, I talk about it and I'm so excited about it because it really does give us the opportunity to open up the full suite of Apple's lines of business and subject matter expertise to students who are eagerly learning about new spaces and technology as the sector is changing. So there's just tremendous opportunity to drive that work throughout a company if you look at it as the role of every individual. In our case, we've been incredibly fortunate where we haven't had to do a lot of solicitation for ideas or for support for this work. We've been inundated with people across the company saying, I have this idea, I have this initiative I want to carry out. How does this fit in with your mission? And so I'm really, really grateful for the passion of teams at Apple that are really doing that work. You've been in this space for a long time, but I think if there's anything I've learned as I've been doing this is that there are new learnings every single day. And we've all recognized that there's heightened public awareness around racial justice. And I think that's probably put your work more front and center than it maybe has been in the past. What has been the most surprising to you in this kind of new moment that we find ourselves in?
You know, one of the things that's most surprising is as a Black woman, as a Black woman who owns an investment firm, there's been a lot of conversation about racial justice for a while. But my personal experience was that it always felt a bit muted. Finance has had an approach that, really, especially on the investment side of things, finance doesn't have that much to do with race and racial justice. We're just out here investing money. And what's been really surprising is that as we really made the call for investors to come in and deal with these issues around racial justice and to claim the history that our financial sector has in making profits off of stolen land and the stolen labor of Black people that was used to build this country. I've been so pleasantly surprised by the openness and the willingness of investors to really come to that conversation. I mean, it's really just surprising. Most people don't know that the very first slave market in New York, and it continued to be the major slave outpost, was actually on Wall Street, where we now trade, right, our stocks and bonds, and that was actually built by slaves, and the very first bonds that ever existed were based on an idea of a mortgage, but it wasn't a mortgage on a home; it was a mortgage on the human life of slaves that were considered property. And I believe that just starting to share some history that helps finance come to a place of understanding its role and accountability for the system that we're now in. It's been really wonderful to finally hear that volume turned up. And I have to admit, as a Black woman, we talk a lot about issues of race and intersectional justice. But after last year, it's been huge just to actually hear that message getting amplified further inside of the financial sector. One of the things that we're now working with is the fact that while lots of people are interested in what we have to say and what other people of color have to say inside of the financial sector, the assets that are actually managed haven't moved to those of us who are the owners of investment management firms. And that's something that I would like to actually see change. And we've started a campaign called the Due Diligence 2.0 Commitment, because one of the things that I and other Black managers realized in our industry is that we were getting a lot more interest, particularly last year, as asset owners were calling for diversity, equity, inclusion, kind of among the investment firms that were chosen by the consultants and wealth managers, those people we call allocators that they're working with. But we were getting to a due diligence process and we weren't passing it, not because we weren't actually capable, but it's truly because those processes actually just kept money in the hands of those who already manage significant assets. And that's a perfect example of systems change that's needed. So if I had even one small act for folks to consider, it's if you're an allocator, so that means if you're a financial advisor, wealth manager, investment consultant, go to duediligencecommitment.com. Take a look at that. It's a roadmap of 9 different steps that can be taken to begin to eliminate systemic bias from your due diligence process. If what we want is a new world, one that's more just and equitable, inclusive, and one that's actually putting assets in the hands of those who historically haven't necessarily had them to kind of lead us toward those solutions, we're going to have to come up with equally rigorous but alternative processes that actually allow managers like Adesina Social Capital and the less than 1% of other investment management firms that are majority owned by women and people of color. I know that sounds surprising, but it's true. There's 0.9% of us are majority owned by women and people of color. We're going to have to come up with an alternative process, and we've really laid a roadmap out there for folks moving forward. So looking kind of at our time, as our time is beginning to come to a close, I just want to highlight that Apple's built its brand on quality products, but it's this launch of the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative that shows that the company stands for so much more. And what would you say to the CEO listening who might think this work isn't part of their brand or doesn't align with their version of what they think of as sustainable?
It's a great question. And I love what you said about systems change, because I think for so many people who are just coming into education about systemic racism, it hasn't resonated yet for a lot of leaders, the extent to which this work should change the way that they do business. And so I really hope that for anyone listening who is still grappling with what this looks like, that they are preparing themselves for the fact that to really dive into this work means that in 2 years and 3 years and 5 years, your business will look different. I think if you are a business that has succeeded in this country, in this world, in this society, you've benefited from systemic racism and injustice. It's baked into our society. And so true change and truly addressing that racism means shifting resources to the communities that have been underserved for so long, who have been blocked access to opportunity. And as you've said so many times and so pointedly, it means centering those communities in the solution. And so listening, having those conversations from the beginning is so important. And then finding ways to bring that input and those perspectives into the solutions going forward are critically important. But I think it does start with that recognition and that realization. So I will turn that question back to you and just say, for anyone who is listening right now, who is looking at investing and who is looking at investing through the lens of systemic racism and looking to advance justice, what is one key takeaway? If there's anything they heard from this conversation, what do you want them to walk away with today?
Well, you know, Alicia, I can never leave it to just one key takeaway, but I will be as succinct as possible. Definitely, if you're allocating capital and you really want to overcome some of those barriers that keep you from really having diverse managers in your portfolio, check out the Due Diligence 2.0 commitment for asset managers. So those are folks who are in my seat that are actually directing the capital, figuring out where to put the money. Whether you're in the private or public market, please ensure that as you invest in areas like climate solutions, you're considering the ways in which other justice areas intersect with climate. And that's not always easy to do. So it does mean some additional work on our end, but I can tell you the market is hungry for it. The asset owners are telling the allocators that it's something they want. So the more we can center that, the closer we're actually getting to building a more equitable world, and the closer that you're really going to be getting to meeting your clients' needs and desires. So, and for everyone that's here, we're all investors. So make sure your voice as an investor is heard through advocacy measures like the Racial Justice Investing Statement, or for the Canadians with us today, the RIA Anti-Racism Pledge. And really, I believe that it's incumbent ultimately upon all of us to understand the history of this country, or whichever country we're sitting in, and wherever we sit, to place the power that we have. Because if you are in this room, you have outsized power. Place your power in service of justice so that we are all living in a more just, equitable, and inclusive world. Any final statements from you, Alicia, before we wrap things up?
Just to say thank you to you. The work you're doing is so important. Your leadership is so necessary. So really appreciate you sharing today. I've learned in the past few days, as you and I have been talking, I've learned so much, and just really excited to continue this work and grateful to have partners like you in the space that are really driving this work forward.
Wonderful. So, and thank you, Alicia, for doing this session with me. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is really just the tip of the iceberg for sessions focused on building a just and inclusive economy at Ceres 2021. So